My name is June Keith. I am 41 years old, and I have built a career rising from the daughter of a grease-stained mechanic to a brigadier general in the United States Air Force. For years, I poured my time, my money, and my loyalty into keeping my family happy, especially after my father remarried. But none of that rank, none of those medals, could protect me from the most humiliating moment of my life at the Grand Hyatt Gala that night. My stepmother, Lynn, her eyes manic with jealousy, lunged at me through a crowd of high society guests. She screamed, "You are a thief!" And then, with violent force, she ripped the brooch right off my shoulder. The gold pin tore through the fabric and sliced into my skin. But that physical pain was nothing compared to the shame of seeing my father standing there, looking down at his shoes in silence, just as he has done for the last 15 years. Have you ever been discarded or humiliated by the very people you sacrificed everything for? If yes, share your experience in the comments. Believe me, you are not alone. Before I dive into exactly what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being disrespected, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries, self-worth, and taking your power back. What happened after that night might not be what you expect. The air inside the Grand Hyatt ballroom that evening was thick, suffocatingly so. It smelled of expensive roast beef, heavy floral centerpieces, and the unmistakable scent of old money, a mixture of Chanel No. 5 and entitlement. I stood near the center of the room, holding a flute of sparkling water that I had no intention of drinking. I was the guest of honor, technically. I was wearing my Air Force mess dress, the formal evening uniform. It's a midnight blue shell, stiff with starch and tradition, adorned with the silver star on my shoulder that I had worked 2 decades to earn. To the outside world, I looked like a fortress, strong, disciplined, impenetrable. But inside that stiff wool uniform, I was just June, the little girl who desperately wanted her dad to be proud of her. I felt a shift in the room's atmosphere before I even saw her. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Lynn entered the ballroom. She was 52, but she fought the aging process with a desperation that was painful to watch. She was wearing a dress that was entirely too red and entirely too tight for a formal military gala. It was a look-at-me dress. She had a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, her third or fourth, judging by the slight sway in her step. And she made a beeline for me. My father, Thomas, trailed behind her like a shadow. He looked uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, his rough mechanic's hands fidgeting with his cufflinks. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, gave a weak, apologetic half-smile, and then looked away. That was my dad. The enabler. The man who would set himself on fire just to keep Lynn warm. Well, Lynn's voice was a sugary purr that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She stepped into my personal space, close enough that I could smell the stale gin beneath her perfume. Don't you look severe? I straightened my back, a reflex from basic training. Hello, Lynn. Hello, Dad. Lynn looked me up and down, her lip curling in distaste as she surveyed my uniform. To her, this wasn't a symbol of service. It was a costume that stole attention away from her. She leaned in, dropping her voice to a whisper so the nearby colonel and his wife couldn't hear. You look like a man in that getup, June, she hissed, her smile never wavering for the public to see. Honestly, it's embarrassing. Your mother would be ashamed to see you looking so hard, so unlovable. The words were precision strikes, aimed at the softest parts of my armor. She knew exactly where to hit. She knew my deepest insecurity was that I had traded my femininity for my rank, that I had become the fixer, who didn't need love, only orders. I clenched my jaw so hard I felt a molar crack. This is a uniform, Lynn. It commands respect. Respect? She laughed, a brittle, high-pitched sound. You think these people respect you? They pity you, an old maid playing soldier. Just then, a senator approached us. He didn't know the toxicity swirling between us. He smiled broadly, extending a hand to me. General Keith, he boomed. I just wanted to say, that speech you gave earlier about sacrifice, moving, truly moving, your family must be incredibly proud. The senator turned to Lynn and my dad. "You must be beaming." That was the spark. I saw it happen in Lynn's eyes. The attention was on me. The praise was for me. The narcissistic injury was too much for her to bear. Her face flushed a blotchy, angry red. "Proud?" Lynn's voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was rising, shrill, and jagged. "Why should we be proud?" The conversation in our immediate circle died. The senator looked confused. "I beg your pardon." "She's a fraud," Lynn shrieked. The sound cut through the low hum of the jazz band like breaking glass. I froze. "Lynn, stop." "Don't you tell me to stop." She lunged. It happened in slow motion. I saw her manicured hand, claws painted a violent crimson, reaching out. She wasn't aiming for my face. She was aiming for the one thing on my uniform that wasn't standard issue. The brooch. It was an antique gold pin, shaped like a pair of wings, pinned securely above my ribbons. It was the only thing I was wearing that belonged to my biological mother. "You stole this!" Lynn yelled, grabbing the brooch. "This is family property. You're a thief, June, a ungrateful, stealing little brat." "Lynn, let go," I gasped, grabbing her wrist. She didn't let go. She yanked. She pulled with the hysterical strength of a woman who felt her spotlight slipping away. "Reep!" The sound was sickeningly loud in the silent ballroom. It wasn't just the sound of the pin popping open. It was the sound of the thick, expensive wool of my mess dress tearing. The clasp of the brooch gave way, but not before the pin drove deep into the soft flesh of my shoulder. I flinched, a sharp, hot bolt of pain shooting down my arm. But the physical pain was distant, muted by the shock. Lynn stumbled back, clutching the brooch in her hand like a trophy. A jagged flap of my dark blue uniform hung loose, exposing the white shirt underneath. A small circle of blood began to stain the white fabric, bright and horrifying. The entire ballroom was dead silent. 200 pairs of eyes, generals, senators, their spouses, were staring at us. Staring at the crazy woman in the red dress. Staring at the general with the torn uniform. But I wasn't looking at the crowd. I was looking at my father. "Dad," I whispered. My voice sounded small, like the 10-year-old girl who used to hand him wrenches in the garage. Thomas stood there, 5 feet away. He saw the blood. He saw the tear. He saw the absolute humiliation burning my face. He didn't move. He didn't step forward to check on me. He didn't yell at Lynn. He slowly, agonizingly, turned his head and looked at the floor, studying the pattern of the carpet as if his daughter wasn't bleeding in front of the city's elite. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The throbbing in my shoulder synced with the pounding of my heart. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the pin that hurt. It was the silence. That familiar, cowardly silence that I had been making excuses for my entire adult life. As I stood there, clutching my torn shoulder, watching my father refuse to meet my eyes, the glitter of the Grand Hyatt dissolved. The smell of expensive perfume faded, replaced by the phantom smell of motor oil and cheap coffee. My mind didn't stay in the ballroom. The shock was too much. It catapulted me back. Back before the stars on my shoulder. Back before Lynn. Back to the garage and the man my father used to be before he let himself be hollowed out. I looked at the brooch in Lynn's hand, glittering under the chandeliers, and suddenly, I wasn't 41 anymore. I was a child again. And the story of that brooch and how we ended up here began to play in my memory like an old, painful movie. The sharp sting of the gold pin digging into my shoulder in the Grand Hyatt ballroom was grounding, in a cruel way. It was a specific kind of pain, sharp, metallic, and sudden. It reminded me of the time I cut my hand on a rusted fender when I was 12, trying to help my dad in the garage. Back then, my father, Thomas, didn't stand there and look at his shoes while I bled. He had scooped me up, his face pale with worry, and carried me to the kitchen sink to wash the cut with the gentleness of a man handling a baby bird. That was the man I remembered. That was the man who had slowly disappeared, replaced by the ghost standing next to Lynn in a rented tuxedo. As the murmur of the horrified crowd faded into the background, my mind retreated to the safety of the past. I needed to remember him as he was, to understand why I was still standing here, taking this abuse, instead of walking away. Our house wasn't much. It was a small siding-clad box in a neighborhood where the lawns were mostly crabgrass and the driveways were stained with oil. But it was home. After my mother passed away from ovarian cancer, a battle that left us with a mountain of medical bills and a quiet, echoing emptiness in the hallway. It was just the two of us. My dad was a mechanic. He didn't just work on cars, he breathed them. He worked at Miller's Auto Body for 30 years, pulling 60-hour weeks just to keep the lights on and put food on the table. To this day, the smell of Gojo hand cleaner, that gritty orange-scented paste, makes me want to cry. It was his cologne. No matter how hard he scrubbed his hands with that stiff bristle brush every night, the grease never fully came out. It was permanently etched into the fingerprints of his calloused hands, a tattoo of his sacrifice. He wasn't a man of many words. He didn't know how to do the emotional support thing that parents do today. We didn't talk about our feelings. We talked about gaskets, spark plugs, and whether the Mets had a shot at the pennant this year. But I never doubted that I was the center of his universe. I remember the day I left for basic training. It was a gray, overcast Tuesday in October. We drove to the recruitment center in his old 1998 Chevy Silverado. The truck had more rust on the wheel wells than paint, and the heater rattled like a dying lung. But he kept the engine running smooth as silk. The ride was silent. The radio played a low country song, something about leaving and coming home, filling the awkward space between us. I was terrified. I was 19, skinny, and leaving the only world I had ever known. When we pulled up to the curb, he put the truck in park but didn't unlock the doors immediately. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. "June," he said, his voice rough, like gravel crunching under tires. He didn't look at me. He stared out the windshield at the rain. "You keep your head down. You listen to your TI. You show 'em what you're made of." "I will, Dad." He reached into the front pocket of his faded flannel shirt and pulled out a $20 bill. It was crumpled, soft from being in the wash, and stained with a faint smudge of motor oil. "Take this," he said, shoving it into my hand. "Dad, I don't need—" "Take it," he insisted, his voice cracking just a fraction. "For food on the road, or a phone card, just take it." I knew that $20 was probably his lunch money for the next week. I knew he would be eating peanut butter sandwiches until payday. I took the bill, fighting back tears, and shoved it into my pocket. That $20 felt heavier than the duffel bag I carried on my back. It was the weight of his love, expressed in the only currency he had. Years later, when I was deployed to Iraq, his letters became my lifeline. They weren't poetic. They were written on lined notebook paper, usually with a blue ballpoint pen that skipped. "Dear June, hope you are safe. Replace the transmission on Mrs. Higgins's Buick today. Took 4 hours. The dog misses you. I miss you. Love, Dad." Short, simple. But every time I opened one of those envelopes, I could smell the faint scent of cigarette smoke and engine oil. And it felt like a hug. I found out later from a neighbor that he had slapped a giant bumper sticker on that rusted Chevy. "My daughter protects your freedom, U.S. Air Force." He would point it out to anyone at the grocery store, beaming with a pride that made his tired eyes light up. But pride doesn't cure loneliness. When I came home on leave after my second tour, I saw the toll the years had taken. I walked into the house unannounced and found him sitting in his recliner in the dark. The only light came from the flickering blue glow of the television. He was eating a hungry man frozen dinner, rubbery Salisbury steak and dry corn, straight out of the foil tray. The house was silent. The silence of a man who had no one to tell about his day, no one to ask him if he was tired, no one to share that cheap, watery coffee with in the morning. My heart broke right there in the living room doorway. I felt guilty. I was out building a career, seeing the world, becoming an officer, and he was here, fading away in the blue light of the TV. "Dad," I had said, sitting on the armrest of his chair, "you can't live like this. You need to get out. Join a club. Go to the VFW dances. Find a companion. I pushed him. I pushed him because I loved him. I pushed him because I didn't want him to die alone in that recliner. I want to pause here and ask you guys something. Have you ever encouraged a parent to start dating again because you were worried about them, only to regret it later? Or do you miss the version of your parents before a toxic partner took over? If this resonates with you, please hit that like button and comment, "I remember" below. It's a small way to honor the people they used to be before everything changed. I didn't know it then, but that push was the beginning of the end. I thought I was saving him from loneliness. I thought I was helping him find happiness. Instead, I was unlocking the front door and rolling out the red carpet for the devil. I stood there in the Grand Hyatt, the torn fabric of my uniform hanging loose, and I looked at the man studding the carpet. I asked myself the question that haunts me every single night. Where did the man who gave me his last $20 go? He was gone. And in a twisted, heartbreaking way, I knew it was my fault. I had wanted him to find a partner. Well, he found one. And now she was wearing a red dress, holding my mother's brooch, and smiling like she had just won a war. But the war wasn't over. In fact, as I watched Lynn's smug satisfaction, I realized something. The war had just begun. And unlike my father, I wasn't going to surrender. They say the devil doesn't come to you with horns and a pitchfork. He comes as everything you've ever wished for. In my dad's case, she came bearing a Tupperware container of homemade meatloaf and a smile that could brighten a room. Her name was Lynn. I met her about 6 months after I urged my dad to get back out there. She was a cashier at the local hardware store where Dad bought his parts. She was 52, vibrant, and seemed to hang on his every word. At first, I was relieved. I truly was. The love bombing phase, a term I learned much later in therapy, was textbook perfect. When I came home to visit, the house was clean. There were curtains on the windows where bare blinds used to be. The smell of stale tobacco was replaced by the aroma of pot roast and apple pie. "June, honey," Lynn would chirp, rushing to hug me the moment I walked through the door. "Look at you. My goodness, Thomas, doesn't she look heroic? Our very own protector of the skies." She played the part of the doting stepmother flawlessly. She bragged about my rank to the neighbors. She straightened my collar. She poured my dad's coffee and laughed at his same 3 jokes like she was hearing them for the first time. For the first time in years, I saw my dad smiling, really smiling. The shadows under his eyes lightened. He stood a little taller. I let my guard down. I thought, finally. He's safe. I can stop worrying. But safety, I learned, has a price tag. And Lynn was about to start sending me the bill. It started small. Innocent, almost. "Oh, June," Lynn whispered to me one afternoon while we were washing dishes. "I hate to bother you, but the water heater is making this awful clanking sound. Your father is so worried about the cost. You know, being on a fixed income with Social Security. I just don't want him taking cold showers in December." It was a reasonable request. My dad was on a fixed income. I was a major at the time, making decent money, single with no dependents. "Don't worry, Lynn," I said, pulling out my checkbook. "Call the plumber. I'll cover it." "You are an angel," she beamed. "A literal angel." That was the first crack in the dam. Once money started flowing, it never stopped. A month later, it was the roof. "The shingles are rotting, June. If it leaks, the mold could kill him." Another check, $2,000. Then it was the HVAC system. Then it was new tires for the truck because safety first. Every time I wrote a check, I told myself I was doing it for Dad. I was being the good daughter. I was the fixer. But looking back, I realized I wasn't paying for repairs. I was paying for access to my father. I was paying a subscription fee to keep him happy. The turning point, the moment the mask truly slipped, happened 2 years in. Dad had a health scare. He collapsed in the yard. It turned out to be severe dehydration and a minor arrhythmia. But at his age, it was terrifying. I was stationed in Germany at the time and flew back immediately, my stomach in knots the entire flight. The American healthcare system is a beast, even with insurance. By the time I got to the hospital, the administrative vultures were already circling. There were copays, out-of-network fees, and a massive deductible that hadn't been met. I found Lynn in the cafeteria, looking frazzled but oddly put together, wearing a brand new outfit I knew my dad couldn't afford. "Thank God you're here," she said, skipping the hug. "They're talking about discharging him tomorrow, but he's not ready. And the bill? June. They want $3,000 up front for the deductible before they'll schedule his follow-up stress test." $3,000. That was a significant chunk of my savings at the time. I had been saving for a down payment on a small condo near the base. I didn't hesitate. I walked to the billing department and slapped my credit card down. I signed the receipt, feeling the weight of the debt settle onto my shoulders, but telling myself it was worth it. My dad was alive. I walked back to the hospital room, receipt in hand, expecting relief, maybe a thank you. Dad was in the bed, looking pale and small among the wires. Lynn was sitting in the visitor's chair, flipping through a magazine. "It's taken care of," I said, my voice thick with jet lag. "I paid the $3,000. He gets the test." Dad looked at me, tears welling in his eyes. "June, you didn't have to." "Shh," I squeezed his hand. "It's fine, Dad." "Well," Lynn interrupted, snapping her magazine shut. She didn't look at me. She looked around the room, her nose crinkled in disgust. "Since you're spending all that money, couldn't you have sprung for a private room? This semi-private is disgusting. The man in the next bed snores like a freight train. Your father can't rest here." The air left the room. I stared at her. "Excuse me?" "I'm just saying," Lynn huffed, smoothing her skirt. "If you really cared about his recovery, you'd want him to have peace and quiet. Squeezing him in here like cattle, it's disrespectful. Especially for an officer's father." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the ingratitude, it was the entitlement. The audacity to reach into my pocket, take $3,000, and then complain that I didn't give more. I turned to my father, waiting for him to defend me. Waiting for the man who taught me about respect and hard work to tell her she was out of line. Dad looked at Lynn, then he looked at me. He saw the anger flashing in my eyes. "Now, Lynn," he said weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "June did a nice thing." "I'm just looking out for you, Thomas," Lynn snapped, playing the victim instantly. "Someone has to, since your daughter is always off playing war games." Dad shrank back into his pillows. He looked away, focusing on the heart monitor beeping steadily beside him. "Let's not fight," he murmured. "Please, just let it go, June. Let it go." That phrase hit me harder than the credit card bill. In that sterile hospital room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the illusion shattered. I wasn't helping my father. I was enabling a hostage situation. I realized then that my father had changed. He wasn't the strong protector anymore. He was a man afraid of being alone, afraid of the silence, and he was willing to let this woman bleed me dry if it meant she stayed. I looked at Lynn, who was back to reading her magazine as if she hadn't just insulted me. I looked at my dad, who refused to meet my gaze. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was a cold, hard knot of resentment. I was becoming nothing more than a walking checkbook, an ATM with a pulse. I walked out of that hospital room without saying goodbye. I needed air. I needed to breathe. I walked straight to my rental car in the parking garage, sat in the driver's seat, and just screamed until my throat burned. I was exhausted, not just tired, soul deep, exhausted. I had spent my life trying to be the good soldier, the good daughter, the provider. And all it had gotten me was a maxed-out credit card and a stepmother who looked at me with contempt. I started the engine. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back to that house. I drove aimlessly for miles, the city lights blurring through my tears until I saw the familiar steeple of the base chapel rising against the night sky. I pulled in. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find the only weapon that could help me fight back: the truth. To understand why I stayed in that toxic house for so long, you have to understand the schizophrenia of my life back then. I was living two completely different existences, separated by a 20-minute car ride. On base, I was Lieutenant Colonel Keith. I had just been promoted. I walked down the hallways of the operations group, and airmen snapped to attention. I made decisions that involved millions of dollars of aircraft and the lives of pilots. I was respected, I was competent, I was powerful. But the moment I drove my sedan into my father's driveway, the rank evaporated. The confidence dissolved. I wasn't a lieutenant colonel anymore. I was just June, the inconvenience. I remember one Thanksgiving specifically. It was the year I pinned on my silver oak leaves. I had spent the morning volunteering at the base dining facility, serving turkey to young airmen who couldn't go home to their families. I felt useful. I felt proud. Then I went to my dad's house. The moment I walked in, Lynn didn't say hellosi. She didn't ask about my promotion, even though I was wearing my service dress uniform because I had come straight from duty. Finally, she huffed, wiping her hands on a stained apron. The sink is full. I've been cooking for 6 hours. The least you can do is handle the cleanup while I entertain the guests. The guests were her bridge club friends. My dad was in the living room, eyes glued to the Cowboys game, drinking a beer. He didn't look up. So, the lieutenant colonel took off her service coat, rolled up the sleeves of her blue shirt, and spent 3 hours scrubbing gravy pans and scraping cranberry sauce off china plates. At one point, I accidentally chipped a wine glass while washing it. "For God's sake, June!" Lynn shrieked from the dining room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are so clumsy. No wonder you're not married. You'd probably break the poor man's neck trying to hug him." The room erupted in laughter. My dad laughed too. That laughter broke something inside me. It wasn't a loud break. It was a quiet, internal fracture. I finished the dishes, dried my hands, put my service coat back on, and walked out the back door without saying a word. I drove. I couldn't go home to my empty apartment, and I couldn't go back to that house. My car seemed to drive itself on autopilot, pulling me back to the only place where I felt like I had a soul: the base chapel. It was late, nearly 2100 hours. The chapel was dim, smelling of beeswax candles and lemon polish. I sat in the back pew, still in my uniform, and buried my face in my hands. "You know," a voice echoed from the front of the sanctuary, "the enemy usually attacks hardest when we're trying to do the most good." I looked up. Walking down the aisle was Chaplain Mara. She was a lieutenant colonel, like me, but she carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank. She was an African-American woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen combat zones and broken hearts, and she possessed a stillness that made you feel like you were standing on holy ground. "Chaplain," I wiped my eyes hastily, trying to compose myself. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here." Mara sat down in the pew in front of me, turning to face me. She didn't offer a tissue. She offered the truth. "I saw your promotion ceremony, June," she said, her voice like warm honey and gravel. "You looked like a lioness. So why are you sitting here crying like a lost lamb?" "Because I'm a fraud," I whispered. The confession tumbled out. "I command respect out there, Mara. But at home, I'm nobody. I let them treat me like dirt, and I take it. Because the Bible says to honor your father and mother. And I'm terrified that if I stop helping them, if I stop paying, if I stop taking the abuse, I'm a bad daughter. I'm a sinner." Mara looked at me for a long time. She reached out and tapped the silver oak leaf on my collar. "June, let me ask you something. When you send pilots into a storm, do you send them in naked? Or do you make sure they have protection?" "Protection, of course," I said. "Then why do you walk into that house defenseless?" She leaned in, her expression fierce. "The Bible does say to honor your parents, but nowhere does it say you must offer yourself up as a human sacrifice to their dysfunction. Honoring them means respecting their role in giving you life. It does not mean letting them destroy the life you were given." She opened the small Bible she carried. Ephesians 6:11. "Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." Mara closed the book. "Sometimes the devil isn't a shadowy figure, June. Sometimes the schemes look like guilt trips, manipulation, and financial abuse. God gave you armor, your dignity, your boundaries, your self-worth. Taking that armor off when you walk through your father's door isn't piety. It's surrender." I sat there stunned. I had always thought setting boundaries was an act of rebellion. Mara was telling me it was an act of spiritual warfare. What do I do? I asked, my voice trembling. They are all I have. No, Mara said firmly. They are your biology. We are your family. The people who respect you. The people who see you. She stood up and looked at my bare uniform shirt. You need a reminder. A physical reminder of who you are. So when that woman tries to tear you down, you remember that you are protected. I have my rank, I said. Rank is for the Air Force. Mara shook her head. You need something for June. Did your mother, your real mother, leave you anything? A brooch, I said, thinking of the gold wings tucked away in my jewelry box. A gold pin shaped like wings. She wore it every Sunday. Wear it, Mara commanded. Put it on your uniform, hidden in plain sight or right out in the open. Let it be your shield. When that woman speaks her poison, you touch that pin, and you remember. You are the daughter of a woman who loved you, and you are a child of God. You are not her servant. I drove home that night feeling different. The situation hadn't changed. Lynn was still a narcissist, and my dad was still an enabler. But I had changed. The next morning, before I went to work, I opened my jewelry box. I took out the gold wing brooch. I pinned it right above my ribbons. It wasn't regulation, strictly speaking, but I didn't care. It felt heavy. It felt like a shield. I didn't know it then, but by pinning that brooch to my chest, I wasn't just accessorizing. I was drawing a line in the sand. And I was giving Lynn a target. Because nothing infuriates a narcissist more than seeing their victim find a backbone. The thing about wearing armor is that it doesn't just protect you. It provokes the people who are used to seeing you defenseless. After my talk with Chaplain Mara, I started wearing my mother's gold wing brooch every time I visited my father. It was a small rebellion, a shiny golden declaration that I belonged to a history Lynn couldn't touch. And Lynn hated it. Narcissists have a sixth sense for independence. They can smell it like a shark smells blood in the water. The moment I stopped seeking her approval, her campaign to destroy my reputation shifted into overdrive. It started with the rewriting of history. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, I stopped by the house on a Sunday afternoon. Lynn was hosting a garden party for the neighborhood ladies, a group of women who drank too much iced tea and traded gossip like currency. I walked around the side of the house to the patio and froze. Lynn was holding court, a glass of wine in her hand, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. It's just so hard, you know? Lynn sighed, dabbing at a dry eye. I sacrificed my prime years to raise that girl. I gave up my career to make sure she had a mother figure. And now that she's a big-shot officer, she hardly visits. She treats Thomas like an ATM. It breaks my heart, really. Ungrateful. I stood there, my hand gripping the cold metal of the gate. She raised me. I was 25 when she met my father. She hadn't sacrificed a single day. In fact, I was the one paying for the very patio furniture she was sitting on. I wanted to storm in there. I wanted to scream the truth. But I felt the weight of the brooch on my chest, and I remembered Mara's words. Do not engage with the enemy on their terrain. I turned around and walked away. But silence has a price. By not fighting back, I let her paint me as the villain in my own hometown. The Cold War turned hot inside the house a week later. It was over the brooch. We were in the living room. I was helping Dad set up his new cable box, another bill I was paying. Lynn walked in, her eyes immediately locking onto the gold wings pinned to my sweater. You know, she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, that pin is awfully tacky. It looks like costume jewelry you'd buy at a garage sale. It belonged to my mother, I said calmly, not looking up from the remote. Well, bless her heart, Lynn sneered. But it clashes with your outfit. It makes you look old, June. Why don't you let me put it away for safekeeping? I have a jewelry box in the back where I keep the less valuable things. No, I said. The air in the room vanished. Excuse me? Lynn's voice dropped an octave. I said no. I'm wearing it. It stays with me. Lynn didn't scream. Not yet. She turned to my father, her face crumpling into a mask of wounded fragility. Thomas, do you hear how she speaks to me? I try to help her fashion sense, and she snaps at me, in my own home. My dad looked up from his newspaper. He looked tired. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked at Lynn winding herself up for a tantrum, and then he looked at me, standing firm for the first time in years. I waited. I waited for him to say, "Lynn, leave her alone. That was her mother's." Instead, he took a deep breath and let it out. A long, defeated sigh. "June," he said softly. "Come on. Don't cause a scene. Dee Dee is just trying to help." "She called Mom's brooch tacky, Dad," I said, my voice trembling. "She didn't mean it like that," he lied. He stood up and walked over to me, lowering his voice so Lynn wouldn't hear. "Look, honey, just take it off while you're here. Please? You know how she gets. She's getting older, her nerves are bad. Just let it go." For me? To keep the peace? Just let it go. Those 4 words were worse than any insult Lynn could have thrown. My father wasn't asking for peace, he was asking for my submission. He was asking me to erase my mother, erase my dignity, just so he wouldn't have to deal with his wife's mood swings. He was trading my self-worth for his quiet evening. "I can't do that anymore, Dad," I whispered. I didn't take the brooch off, but the victory felt hollow. The final straw came in the form of a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the Air Force crest. I had been selected as the guest of honor for the annual Air Force Ball at the Grand Hyatt. It was a huge career milestone. I was excited to bring my dad. I wanted him to see what I had built, to see the world where I wasn't just June the inconvenience. But Lynn intercepted the mail. "We are going," she announced when I called, before I could even ask Dad. "Finally, a chance to dress up. I need a new gown, and Thomas needs a tuxedo." "Lynn, the tickets are limited," I started. "Don't be selfish, June," she snapped. "After all we've done for you, it's the least you can do." And then came the demand. She dragged me to Nordstrom the weekend before the event. She picked out a bright red gown, sequined, loud, and incredibly expensive. "It's $800, Lynn," I said, looking at the tag. "Put it on the card." She waved her hand dismissively. "Consider it payback for the roof repair stress you caused us." I bought the dress. I bought the dress because I was stupid enough to hope that if I gave her this one big night, if I let her shine, she would finally be satisfied. I thought if she saw me being honored by generals and senators, she might finally respect me. I was wrong. Narcissists don't feel respect. They feel envy. And envy is a hungry beast. The night of the gala, I sent a town car to pick them up. I met them in the lobby of the Grand Hyatt. The car ride over must have been tense because when the doors opened, the energy coming off Lynn was toxic. She had been pre-gaming, drinking before the event. Her breath smelled of mints and vodka. My dad stepped out first, looking handsome but terrified in his tux. Then Lynn emerged. The red dress was too tight. Her makeup was too heavy. She looked like she was ready for a fight, not a celebration. As we walked toward the ballroom doors, the sounds of jazz music and clinking glasses drifting out, Lynn grabbed my arm. Her nails dug into the fabric of my mess dress. "Don't think you're special just because you're wearing a costume," she hissed into my ear, her voice slurred. "You're still just the mechanic's daughter who couldn't keep a man." My stomach dropped. The dread washed over me, cold and heavy. I looked at my dad walking a few steps ahead, oblivious or pretending to be. We reached the double doors. The usher smiled and pulled them open, revealing the glittering ballroom inside. "After you, General," the usher said respectfully. I stepped into the light, Lynn's red shadow close behind me. I thought I was walking into a celebration. I didn't know I was walking into an ambush. The clock had run out, the peacekeeper had failed, and the brooch on my shoulder was about to become the center of a war. The sound of my uniform tearing seemed to echo in the ballroom long after it happened. Rapey! It was a violent, ugly sound that cut through the polite jazz music and the murmur of conversation like a gunshot. I stood there, frozen. My hand instinctively flew to my left shoulder, covering the exposed white shirt and the angry red scratch where the pin had been ripped away. I could feel the warm trickle of blood under my fingers, sticky and shocking against the starch of my uniform. Lynn stood 2 feet away from me, clutching the gold brooch in her fist. Her chest was heaving, her face flushed with a mixture of drunken adrenaline and triumph. She looked around the room, expecting applause. She expected the senators, the generals, and the high society wives to nod in agreement, to see me as the fraud she had always claimed I was. "See?" Lynn panted, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I told you, she's a thief. She stole this from the family estate. She thinks she's special, but she's just a common thief." The room didn't applaud. The room went deadly, terrifyingly silent. The silence wasn't the polite silence of a library. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a car crash. People set down their champagne flutes. A waiter froze mid-step with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The senator who had been shaking my hand moments ago took a slow, deliberate step back, looking from me to Lynn with an expression of pure horror. But the worst part wasn't the crowd. It was my father. "Dad," I choked out, the words scraping my throat. Thomas stood right next to Lynn. He saw the blood on my hand. He saw the tears of humiliation welling in my eyes, the first tears I'd let the Air Force see in 20 years. He didn't move. He didn't yell at her. He didn't rush to check my wound. He simply closed his eyes and turned his head away, studying the pattern of the expensive hotel carpet, making himself invisible. He was choosing his survival over my dignity. Again. "Well?" Lynn screeched, waving the brooch in the air. "Is no one going to arrest her? Look at this. It's solid gold. She probably planned to pawn it." "Give me that," a voice boomed from the crowd. It wasn't a request. It was an order. A command so deep and authoritative that it seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking through the center of the ballroom was a man I hadn't seen in years, but whose legend was known to every airman on base. Sergeant Major Daniel Cross. He was 82 years old, a veteran of Korea and Vietnam. He walked with a heavy oak cane, clack, clack, clack against the marble floor, but his back was as straight as a steel beam. He was wearing his old dress blues, faded but immaculate, his chest heavy with ribbons. Lynn blinked, confused by this old man interrupting her moment. "Excuse me, this is a private family matter." Daniel didn't stop. He walked right up to her, his eyes cold and hard as flint. He didn't look at her like she was a woman. He looked at her like she was an enemy combatant. "I said," Daniel growled, his voice low and dangerous, "give me that pin before you dirty it any further." Lynn hesitated, intimidated by the sheer force of his presence. It's just jewelry. She stole it." "Jewelry?" Daniel laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. With a speed that belied his age, he reached out and snatched the brooch from Lynn's hand. He held it up to the light, letting the chandeliers catch the gleam of the gold wings. Then, he turned to the crowd. He turned to the generals, the senators, the wives in their designer gowns. "This woman," Daniel pointed a trembling finger at Lynn, "calls this jewelry. She calls this theft." He looked at me, his eyes softening for just a fraction of a second before turning back to the room with renewed fury. "This is not a trinket," Daniel roared, his voice filling the cavernous room without a microphone. "These are the pilot wings of Captain James Miller, this officer's uncle, my commanding officer." A gasp rippled through the room. My breath hitched in my chest. I knew they were my uncle's wings. My mother had given them to me. But I had never realized Daniel knew him. "Captain Miller didn't come home from Normandy," Daniel continued, his voice shaking with emotion. "He died keeping his burning plane in the air long enough for his crew to bail out. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for that action. These wings were cut from his uniform before they buried him." He turned slowly to Lynn, who had gone pale beneath her heavy makeup. The red flush of victory was draining from her face, replaced by the gray pallor of fear. "This general," Daniel gestured to me, "wears these wings to honor a bloodline of heroes. She wears them because she serves the same flag he died for." He took a step toward Lynn, forcing her to stumble back in her high heels. "And you?" Daniel spat the word out like poison. "You dare to call her a thief? You dare to put your hands on her uniform? On this history?" I didn't know." Lynn stammered, looking around for support. She looked at my dad. Thomas, tell him I didn't know. But the room had turned. The social tide had shifted violently. The eyes that had been judging me were now locked on Lynn with absolute disgust. The senator looked at her like she was something he had stepped in on the sidewalk. You didn't know because you don't care, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a scream. You are a small, petty woman standing in the shadow of giants. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as this officer. Daniel turned to the hotel security guards who had quietly appeared at the edge of the circle. Get this trash out of my sight, Daniel ordered. No, wait, Lynn cried, reaching for my father. Thomas, do something. They're humiliating me. My father looked up then. He looked at Daniel, the war hero. He looked at me, holding my bleeding shoulder. And then he looked at Lynn, the woman who had just been stripped naked in front of the people she tried so hard to impress. He opened his mouth, and for a second I thought he might finally fight. We should go, Lynn, he mumbled, looking back down at the floor. Go, Lynn shrieked. You're going to let them talk to me like this? Leave, someone in the crowd shouted. Get out. Another voice joined in. The shame hit Lynn like a physical blow. She realized finally that she had lost. Her face crumpled. She let out a sob that was more anger than sadness, turned on her heel, and ran. She scurried out of the ballroom like a rat caught in the pantry light, her red dress trailing behind her. My father stood there for one agonizing second longer. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness, or maybe just permission to leave. I didn't give it to him. I just stared. He turned and shuffled after Lynn, a beaten man following his master. As the heavy doors swung shut behind them, the silence in the room broke. But this time, it wasn't whispers. It was applause. It started with Daniel tapping his cane on the floor. Then the senator joined in. Then, the whole room. They weren't applauding the drama. They were applauding the truth. Daniel walked over to me. With gentle shaking hands, he pinned the gold wings back onto the torn flap of my uniform, right over the bloodstain. Stand tall, General, he whispered, winking at me. Your armor is a little dented, but it held. I looked at the closed doors where my family had just disappeared. My shoulder throbbed, but for the first time in years, the crushing weight on my chest was gone. The secret was out. The monster had been unmasked. I have to ask you guys right now, if you were cheering when Sergeant Major Daniel put Lynn in her place, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a bully get absolutely destroyed by instant karma? Type, justice served below if you loved seeing Lynn run out of there. But as the adrenaline faded, I realized something. The public battle was won, but the private war wasn't over. My father was still out there, in the parking lot with her. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was my last chance to save him, or lose him forever. I looked at Daniel, nodded my thanks, and turned toward the doors. I had one more conversation to finish. The applause inside the ballroom faded as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind me. The transition was jarring. 1 minute, I was bathed in the warm golden glow of chandeliers and vindication. The next, I was stepping into the harsh, fluorescent reality of the hotel valet stand. The air outside was cold, a biting wind that cut right through the tear in my uniform. It smelled of exhaust fumes and city grit, a stark contrast to the expensive perfume inside. I saw them immediately. Lynn was already sitting in the passenger seat of my dad's old sedan, which the valet had pulled up to the curb. She was staring straight ahead, arms crossed, refusing to look at anything. She looked small, defeated, and toxic in that glass cage. My father, however, was standing outside the car. He was leaning against the driver's side door, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, shivering slightly in the wind. A small orange cherry glowed in the darkness near his hand. He was smoking. He hadn't smoked in 10 years. I stopped about 10 feet away. I didn't rush to him. I didn't offer him my coat. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us like a loaded weapon. He saw me. He took one last desperate drag from the cigarette, dropped it to the pavement, and crushed it under the heel of his rented dress shoe. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get them into his pockets. "June," he said. His voice was raspy, broken. He didn't look at me, he looked at the concrete. I'm sorry. I didn't think she'd do that. I don't know what I thought. It was the same apology I'd heard 1,000 times. "I'm sorry," she yelled. "I'm sorry she spent the money. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." "You didn't think," I repeated, my voice flat. "That's the problem, Dad. You never think. You just feel. You feel afraid of being alone, so you let a monster live in our house." "She's not a monster, June," he pleaded weakly, glancing at the car window where Lynn sat like a stone statue. She has a temper. She's insecure." "She physically attacked me," I said, pointing to my shoulder. The blood had dried, making the shirt stiff. "She humiliated me in front of my commanding officers, and you stood there." He flinched as if I had slapped him. I was shocked. I didn't know what to do. "No, Dad," I took a step closer. I needed him to hear this. I needed to break the cycle right here, on this sidewalk. "You knew exactly what to do. You just chose not to do it. You chose her comfort over my safety. You chose your quiet life over my dignity." He looked up at me then, his eyes watery and red-rimmed. "June, please, don't say that. You're my daughter. I love you." "Do you?" I asked. "Because for the last 15 years, your love has felt an awful lot like a transaction. I pay the bills, I fix the roof, I cover the medical deductibles, and in exchange, you let your wife tell me I'm worthless." I saw the realization hit him. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the luxury hotel behind me, then at the cheap sedan beside him. He looked at the woman in the car who had isolated him from everyone he loved. "I'm tired, Dad," I said, my voice softening just a fraction but losing none of its steel. "I am exhausted. I can't be the fixer anymore. I can't buy your happiness. It's too expensive. The price is my soul." I took a deep breath. This was it, the nuclear option. "So here's the deal," I said. "The Bank of June is closed, permanently." Dad blinked. "What?" "I'm cutting it all off," I stated clearly. "The credit cards, the payments for the house repairs, the insurance supplements, everything. I am done subsidizing the woman who hates me." "June, you can't," panic crept into his voice. We live on a fixed income. The house needs work, her medical bills." "That is her problem," I cut him off. "And it's your problem, if you choose to stay with her." I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to look me in the eye. "You have a choice to make, Thomas. Right now. Tonight." I pointed to the car. "You can get in that car with her. You can drive home. You can keep living in that misery, listening to her poison, letting her drive away your friends and family. But if you do it on your own dime. Do not call me when the roof leaks. Do not call me when she overdraws the account." I will not answer. I pointed to the hotel. "Or, you can walk away. You can admit that this isn't love, it's a hostage situation. You can stand by your daughter, and we can figure this out. I will help you. But I will not help her." The wind whipped around us, chilling me to the bone, but I didn't shiver. I felt hot with adrenaline. My father looked at the car. Lynn hadn't moved. She hadn't even rolled down the window to check on him. She was just waiting for her driver to return. Then he looked at me. He looked at the gold wings Sergeant Major Daniel had pinned back onto my chest. He looked at the woman I'd become, a woman who commanded armies, a woman who was finally commanding him. Tears spilled over his wrinkled cheeks. He looked old, so incredibly old. "I'm scared, June," he whispered. "I'm scared of dying alone in that house." "You're already alone in that house, Dad," I said gently. "She doesn't love you. She loves the security I provide." He let out a ragged sob, covering his face with his grease-stained hands. He stood there for a long moment, shaking, wrestling with 15 years of habit and fear. Then he lowered his hands. He took a deep breath of the cold night air. "You're right," he croaked. He turned toward the car. For a second, I thought he was getting in. My heart stopped, but he didn't open the door. He walked to the window, tapped on the glass, and when Lynn looked up, scowling, he made a motion with his hand. Go. He mouthed the words through the glass. I'm staying. Lynn's jaw dropped. She started pounding on the window, screaming something we couldn't hear, but Dad turned his back on her. He walked back to me, his steps a little unsteady, but his head up. I choose you, June, he said, his voice trembling. I'm sorry it took me so long. God, I'm so sorry. I didn't hug him yet. I couldn't. The wound was too fresh. But I nodded. Okay, Dad. Okay. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady. Let's go get you a room for the night, I said. But first, I unlocked my screen and opened my banking app. I had prepared for this moment. I tapped cards. I tapped manage authorized users. I saw Lynn's name listed under the secondary card, the one she used for her groceries that were actually designer clothes. My finger hovered over the delete button. Dad, I said, looking at him. Once I do this, there is no going back. The war starts now. He looked at the sedan pulling away from the curb, tires screeching as Lynn drove off in a rage, leaving her husband standing on the sidewalk. Do it, he said. I tapped the screen. Access revoked. I felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with freedom. The cord was cut. The enabler had awakened, and now we just had to survive the fallout. The morning after the gala, I didn't wake up feeling guilty. I woke up feeling like a general who had finally been given the green light to launch a counteroffensive. My dad was still asleep in the adjoining hotel room, safe and away from the toxic radioactive zone that was his house. I sat at the small desk in my room, a pot of black coffee beside me, my phone in one hand and my laptop in the other. It was 800 hours. The banks were open. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I executed. Yes, this is June Keith, I said into the phone, my voice steady. I am the primary account holder for the Visa signature card ending in 4489. I need to remove an authorized user. Yes, immediately. Click. One tentacle cut. This is regarding the utility service at 124 Maple Drive, I told the power company representative next. I am canceling the auto pay linked to my checking account, effective today. Please switch the billing responsibility back to the resident. Click. Another tentacle cut. I went down the list with ruthless efficiency. The premium cable package Lynn demanded so she could watch her reality shows? Canceled. The landscaping service I paid for because Lynn refused to mow the lawn? Canceled. The monthly transfer to the joint checking account? Stopped. By Aero 900, I had severed every financial artery that connected me to Lynn. I had turned off the tap. I poured a second cup of coffee, feeling a strange, lightheaded buzz. It was the feeling of taking back 15 years of my life. But I knew the retaliation was coming. In psychology, they call it an extinction burst. When a toddler, or a narcissist, realizes their tantrums no longer work, they don't calm down. They escalate. And when they can't control you directly, they try to control how others see you. At 09:15, the first text message arrived. Ding. It wasn't from Lynn. It was from my Aunt Becky, my dad's sister, who hadn't called me on my birthday in a decade, but somehow always knew when family drama occurred. June, I just got off the phone with Lynn. She is hysterical. How could you humiliate her like that? Leaving her at a hotel? Cutting off their funds? You are a wealthy woman, June. Don't be greedy. God sees everything. My stomach tightened. The guilt button. She was mashing it hard. Ding. Another one, this time from my cousin Mike, a man who still lived in his mother's basement. Heard you think you're better than everyone now that you have a star on your shoulder. Leaving your parents to starve? That's elder abuse. You should be ashamed. Ding, ding, ding. The phone began to vibrate across the desk like an angry hornet. Lynn had activated the flying monkeys. Her army of enablers and gossips recruited to do her dirty work. She had spun a narrative where she was the victim, abandoned by the cruel, rich stepdaughter. I stared at the screen, watching the hate pour in. Ungrateful brat. After all she did for you. Your father is heartbroken. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The urge to defend myself was overwhelming. I wanted to type back, I paid for the roof over her head. She physically attacked me. She stole my mother's medals. I typed out a paragraph to Aunt Becky, shaking with rage. Then, I stopped. I heard Chaplain Mara's voice in my head, clear as a bell. Do not explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your silence is a boundary. If I responded, I was giving them what they wanted. Supply. I was engaging in the drama. I took a deep breath, deleted the paragraph, and did something I had never been brave enough to do before. I didn't reply. I tapped the small eye icon in the corner of the message thread. I scrolled down to the bottom in red text. Block caller. I pressed it. Aunt Becky was gone. I opened Mike's message. Block caller. I opened the messages from the neighbors Lynn had poisoned against me. Block, block, block. With every tap of my finger, the noise lessened. It was like shutting doors in a burning building, sealing off the smoke. I wasn't just blocking phone numbers. I was blocking the negativity, the manipulation, and the expectation that I had to explain my existence to anyone. By 10:30 a.m., my phone was silent. I'd built a digital fortress. Meanwhile, across town, the reality of my actions was hitting Lynn in the most visceral way possible. I found out later from a neighbor what happened. Lynn had gone to the high-end grocery store, likely to soothe her wounded ego with expensive wine and gourmet chocolates. She had filled a cart, marched to the register, and swiped the card I had just canceled. Declined, the cashier would have said. Lynn probably argued. She probably told them to run it again. She probably made a scene, claiming it was a bank error. But it wasn't an error. It was a consequence. For the first time in 15 years, Lynn had to reach into her own purse. And she found nothing but dust. That was the breaking point. Without my money, Lynn had no use for my father. She realized the gravy train hadn't just derailed, it had vanished. She went back to the house, but she didn't go back to apologize or wait for her husband. She went back to loot. When my dad and I finally drove to the house later that afternoon, pulling into the driveway with a sense of dread, the front door was standing wide open. We walked inside. The house was trashed. It looked like a tornado had touched down in the living room. Vases were smashed against the walls. The curtains, the ones I paid for, were torn down. But the silence was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of walking on eggshells. It was the hollow, echoing silence of emptiness. The TV was gone. The silver set from the dining room was gone. My dad's small collection of tools from the hall closet was gone. Lynn had packed whatever she could fit into her car and vanished. Dad walked into the kitchen. On the counter, where she used to leave her pile of bills for me to pay, there was nothing. No note, no apology, no, I love you. Just a ring of water from a glass she had left behind. He stood there, looking at the empty space where his wife used to be. I braced myself. I thought he would crumble. I thought he would chase after her. Instead, he walked over to the refrigerator. He opened it, took out a beer, and cracked it open. The sound, pshh, was loud in the quiet kitchen. He took a long sip, closed his eyes, and exhaled. It was the first time I had seen him breathe deeply in years. Well, he said, his voice steady, it looks like we have some cleaning up to do. The vampire had fled the castle. The flying monkeys had been blocked at the gates. And as I looked at my dad, standing amidst the wreckage of his marriage but finally free, I knew the hardest part was over. Now, we just had to rebuild. The first thing I noticed about the house after Lynn left wasn't the silence. It was the smell. For 15 years, the air inside 124 Maple Drive had smelled of Lynn's overpowering floral perfume and the acrid, metallic scent of anxiety. But a month after the Great Purge, as I like to call it, the air smelled like hickory smoke, charcoal, and sweet barbecue sauce. It was a Saturday evening in late May. I sat on the back patio, on one of the lawn chairs I'd bought to replace the fancy set Lynn stole, sipping an iced tea. My dad stood by the Weber grill, a pair of tongs in one hand and a cold Miller High Life in the other. He was wearing an apron that said, Grill Master, a cheesy gift I'd bought him at the BX, but he wore it like it was a tuxedo. "Hey, June," he called out over his shoulder, smoke billowing around him. "How do you like your ribs? Fall off the bone or with a little bite?" "You know the answer, Dad," I smiled. "If I have to use a knife, you failed." He laughed. It was a rusty sound, unused for too long, but it was real. The lines of tension that had permanently etched themselves into his forehead were softening. He looked older, yes, but lighter. The shadow was gone. We ate with our hands, wiping sauce off our chins with paper towels, talking about everything and nothing. The Dodgers' losing streak, the price of gas, the way the hydrangeas were blooming. It was mundane, and it was the most beautiful dinner I'd ever had. "By the way," Dad said, wiping his hands, "Daniel called me. You know, Sergeant Major Cross." "Oh." I looked up. "Yeah. The VFW Post is doing a Memorial Day dinner next week. They want to honor the families of the fallen. Because of, you know, the pin. Your uncle." He fidgeted with his napkin. He asked me to speak. "That's great, Dad," I said. "I don't know." He shook his head, looking down at his plate. "I'm just a grease monkey, June. I don't give speeches. I fix transmissions." "You're the brother of a war hero," I said firmly. "And you're the father of a general. You have plenty to say." He spent the next week agonizing over it. I found him at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by crumpled index cards, chewing on the end of a pen. I helped him organize his thoughts, but I didn't write the words for him. This was his mission. The night of the event, the VFW Post 442 was packed. It was exactly as I remembered from childhood: wood-paneled walls covered in black and white photos, the smell of floor wax and stale beer, and the low murmur of men who had seen too much. The air was thick with patriotism and cheap cologne. I sat at the front table, wearing my service dress uniform. Dad sat next to me in a suit I had bought him, one that actually fit. He was shaking. I could see the paper in his hands trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Breathe," I whispered, squeezing his knee under the table. "Next up," the post commander announced from the small stage, "a man whose family has given more than their fair share to this country, Mr. Thomas Keith." Dad stood up. He walked to the podium slowly. The microphone screeched a little as he adjusted it, and the room went quiet. He looked out at the crowd. He looked at his index cards. Then, he looked at me. He took a deep breath, and he put the cards down. He wasn't going to read. "I came here tonight to talk about my brother, Captain James Miller," Dad began. His voice was rough, unpolished, the voice of a man who worked with iron and steel. "James was a hero. He died so his crew could live. He earned that Medal of Honor." He paused, gripping the sides of the podium until his knuckles turned white. "But, looking around this room, seeing all you brave men and women, it got me thinking about courage." The room was dead silent. Even the ice machine in the back seemed to stop humming. "For the last 15 years, I thought I was a good man," Dad continued, his voice cracking. "I went to work. I paid my taxes. I kept the peace in my house. But I learned recently that keeping the peace isn't the same thing as being brave." My heart started to pound. I hadn't seen this on the index cards. "I watched a war happen in my own living room," Dad said, tears glistening in his eyes under the harsh stage lights. "I watched a woman I married tear down the person I love most in this world. And I stood there. I stood there and looked at my shoes because I was afraid of being alone." He looked directly at me then. He didn't blink. "My brother James died fighting enemies abroad. But my daughter June," he pointed at me, "she fought a war in her own home. She fought for her dignity. She fought for my safety. She fought for our family history when I was too weak to defend it." A tear slid down my cheek. I bit my lip to keep from sobbing. "I used to think my greatest accomplishment was fixing a '68 Mustang," Dad said, a small sad smile touching his lips. "But I was wrong. My greatest accomplishment is sitting right there. General June Keith." He straightened up, and for the first time in my life, he looked like a giant. I was a coward for a long time, he told the room. But my daughter taught me that it's never too late to find your backbone. She's the toughest soldier I know, and I have never been prouder to be her father. He stepped back from the microphone. For a second, there was silence. Then Sergeant Major Daniel stood up in the back and started clapping. Then the commander. Then the whole room. It wasn't polite applause, it was a thunderous, floor-shaking ovation. Dad walked down the steps, looking exhausted but unburdened. He didn't go back to his chair. He came straight to me. I stood up, disregarding protocol, disregarding the uniform. "Dad," I choked out. He pulled me into a hug. He smelled of Old Spice, starch, and just a faint hint of the garage. It was the smell of my childhood. He squeezed me so hard I thought my ribs might crack, but I didn't care. "I'm sorry, Junebug," he whispered into my ear, using the nickname he hadn't used since I was 10. "I see you. I finally see you." I buried my face in his shoulder and let go. I let go of the anger. I let go of the resentment about the money. I let go of the pain of the Grand Hyatt. In that VFW hall, surrounded by strangers and ghosts of the past, the wound finally closed. I didn't need the world to know I was right. I just needed my dad to know I was worth fighting for. And as the applause washed over us, I knew that while the military gave me my rank, my father had just given me back my heart. The flash of a camera went off nearby, pop, capturing the moment. A bright white light that seemed to swallow everything, signaling the end of the dark years and the beginning of the rest of our lives. Time has a funny way of balancing the scales. It doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen when you're screaming into your pillow at 2 a.m. But if you wait long enough, if you keep your head down and do the work, the universe eventually reveals the truth. It has been 15 years since the night of the torn dress at the Grand Hyatt. 15 years of birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners. 15 years of rebuilding a relationship with my father that was almost lost to the fire. Today, I stood in the Hall of Heroes at the Pentagon. The air here is different. It's cool, recycled, and smells of history and floor wax. I wasn't wearing a torn uniform today. I was wearing a pristine service dress coat, the fabric crisp and flawless. I stood at attention as the Air Force Chief of Staff read the orders. Appointing Major General June Keith to the grade of Lieutenant General. 3 stars. I looked down at the front row. Sitting there, in a wheelchair with a portable oxygen tank hooked to the back, was my father. He was 89 years old now. His hair was snow white, and his hands, those hands that used to be permanently stained with grease, were spotted with age and shaking with Parkinson's. But his eyes? His eyes were clear blue steel. When it was time for the pinning ceremony, the aide asked if I wanted him to help. I shook my head. I walked over to my dad, knelt on one knee so I was eye level with him, and handed him the silver stars. It took him a long time. His fingers fumbled with the clasp. The room waited in respectful silence. No one rushed him. Finally, he clicked the stars onto my epaulets. He patted my shoulder, his hand heavy and warm. "You did good, Junebug." He wheezed, his voice weak but filled with 15 years of made-up time. "You did good." I kissed his cheek. "We did good, Dad." The reception afterwards was a blur of handshakes, cake, and flashes from photographers. I felt light. I felt complete. As the crowd began to thin out, I stepped into the outer hallway to catch my breath. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, bathing the marble floors in gold. That's when I saw the ghost. Standing near the security checkpoint, arguing softly with a guard, was a woman. At first, I didn't recognize her. She was stooped over, leaning heavily on a cane. Her clothes were mismatched, a faded floral blouse and gray slacks that looked like they came from a donation bin. Her hair, once dyed a fierce, aggressive blonde, was thin and gray, pulled back in a messy bun. But then she turned, and I saw the eyes. They were sunken and dull, but the hunger was still there. It was Lynn. She saw me. Her eyes widened, taking in the 3 stars on my shoulder, the entourage of aides in the distance, the sheer power radiating from me. She pushed past the guard, who looked at me for a signal. I held up a hand. It's okay. She limped over to me. She smelled of mothballs and stale cigarettes. The glamour, the red dress, the arrogance. It was all gone, eaten away by years of bitterness and burnt bridges. June, she croaked. Her voice was thin, reedy. Look at you, a general. I always knew you had it in you. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just looked at her with the clinical detachment of a doctor examining an old scar. Hello, Lynn. I saw it in the paper, she said, clutching her cheap handbag. The promotion. I told the ladies at the center, that's my girl. I raised her. The lie didn't even make me angry anymore. It just made me sad. What do you want, Lynn? I asked gently. Her face crumbled. The mask of pride slipped, revealing the terrified, lonely woman underneath. I'm not doing so well, June. The state housing is awful. The heater doesn't work. And your father? I heard he's living with you now? In that big house? He is, I said. I miss him, she sniffled, reaching out a trembling hand to touch my sleeve. I made mistakes, June. I know that. But we're family. Don't I deserve a second chance? Can't I just see him? Just for 5 minutes. I looked at her hand, the same hand that had ripped the brooch from my shoulder 15 years ago. I looked at her face, pleading for an entry point, looking for a crack in the armor where she could slip back in and start the cycle all over again. I thought about the years of therapy. I thought about the nights I held my dad while he cried, recovering from her emotional abuse. No, I said. The word hung in the golden light, soft but immovable as a mountain. No. She blinked, tears forming in her eyes. But I thought you were a Christian woman. I thought you believed in forgiveness. I do, I said, and I meant it. I forgive you, Lynn. She brightened, stepping forward. Oh, June. I held up a hand to stop her. I forgive you, I repeated. I forgive you because I refuse to carry the rock of hating you in my pocket for one more day. I forgive you for my own peace, not for your comfort. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper. But forgiveness is not the same thing as access. You lost your seat at our table 15 years ago. You don't get to come back just because you're hungry. Lynn froze. The hope died in her eyes, replaced by a flicker of the old rage, but she was too weak to act on it. She looked at the security guards, then back at me. She realized finally that she had no power here. She was a ghost haunting a house that no longer existed. Goodbye, Lynn, I said. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned around. Dad is waiting, I said to myself. I walked back into the reception hall. My father was sitting by the window, watching the sunset over the Potomac River. When he saw me coming, his face lit up. I walked over and took the handles of his wheelchair. Who was that? He asked, his voice raspy. I thought I saw someone in the hall. I looked back one last time. The hallway was empty. The ghost was gone. Nobody, Dad, I smiled, releasing the brake on his chair. Just a shadow from a long time ago. It's gone now. I pushed him forward, out of the shadows and into the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun. We had survived. We had won. And most importantly, we were free. Looking back, the most expensive lesson I learned wasn't at the Air Force Academy. It was in that parking lot with my father. For years, I believed that love meant setting myself on fire just to keep others warm. I thought saying no was an act of betrayal. But I was wrong. The truth is, we teach people how to treat us. Setting a boundary isn't an act of war. It is an act of self-respect. You can love your family from a distance if being close to them destroys your spirit. Your peace is worth more than their approval. Now, I want to turn this over to you. I know many of you are fighting your own battles in silence right now. If my story gave you even a little bit of courage to stand up for yourself, please hit that like button. It helps this message reach the people who need it most. And drop a comment below. Have you ever had to cut ties with a family member to save your own sanity? I want to read your stories. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys of truth and resilience. Remember, you are the general of your own life. Dismissed.